Hey everyone, how's it going? I am Vincent, and I am a part of the University of Arizona debate series. We're going to be starting in a couple of minutes, so just get comfortable and everything like that for our exciting talk on political correctness today. But in the meantime, if you would like to whip out your phone, give us, you can go on our website on the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, sbs.arizona.edu/UA debate series, and you can find all about us, what we're about, and up to date on our speaker series. We do plan on hosting events in the spring, so make sure to keep an eye out on our website for events that we are going to do. But if you don't want to go on SBS, I know everyone loves social media, so we got your coverage. We got a nice Facebook page, UA Debate Series. We also got a Twitter page and also Instagram page. Our Instagram, we like to post planning for events like these or even practice. So make sure to give all of those a follow and keep up to date with us. But I think we are going to start, and I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Ted McAloop.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started in just 1 minute. I just want to announce a couple things. This is our final speaker series event of the semester, and this was the first semester that we've had such events. And it's been a really, really great semester. We've had some really, really interesting conversations, fantastic speakers. And I hope that everyone stays tuned for our spring semester. We have a lot of events coming up just like this in the spring. If you follow, as Vincent just said, our social media, you'll get updates on that. Hopefully, if you give us your email, which we have a database outside that you can give us your email and your information, and we'll make sure to send you and put you on our email list so that you can get constant updates so you know where it is that we'll be holding our events in the spring. We'll be talking about issues like water rights. We'll be talking about issues like gaming and athletics. We're looking to book as many events as we possibly can, because this has been great, and we hope that you come. Our students are going to be in San Diego next weekend at their fourth tournament of the semester, right? Yeah. And we wish them luck, so let's get a round of applause for our interns. And also to say thank you to all of them. They have absolutely just lifted this entire series, this whole entire semester, and I'm in constant awe of all of them. So thank you guys for doing that. I also want to thank Samantha Kirby and Zach Bergeron, who have helped us with all of our media stuff, with all of our money stuff, which we actually finally have money stuff, which is really great. Just in case you are terribly convinced that we have money stuff, though, you'll notice that we have a donate button up here. So if you go to our website and you really enjoy what you see, $1, 1 cent, whatever it is you feel like donating would be really great, as long as you make sure that you stipulate that you are donating to the UA debate series, because it'll take you to a really generic donation site. So that would be really great. Other than that, I do want to get started tonight. I want to announce a couple things about tonight's event. So we'll be talking about political correctness, which I think is certainly in these days a hot button issue, something I know is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. It's such a hot button and controversial issue that 3 of our speakers were too scared to even show up. But luckily we have the brave and brilliant Dr. Jen Roth-Gordon, who's going to be here to speak with great expertise and to answer your questions about this exact event. And we have Ashley Freedy and Vincent Hasso to help moderate and to get the conversation going. So without further ado, let's get that conversation going. And let's give our moderators a round of applause, and let's start our event.
We're also going to be doing an audience question section towards the end. So if you want to start thinking of those questions now and kind of keep them in mind so we can do that afterwards, that would be great. I don't know why this sounds so weird.
Honestly, this room has such great acoustics, you could probably
just project. Love that.
go without it.
Vincent, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, so if you could just, because there's a lot of people here that are, I guess, may not be exactly informed on like the realm of political correctness. So if you can, just like introduce yourself, like, and we'll go from there.
Sure, sounds good. How am I without the mic? Yeah? Okay. Just wave around a lot if you can't hear me. But I can like project pretty well. You can ask my kids. Okay, so my name is Jen Gordon. I am an associate professor in the School of Anthropology here at the University of Arizona. I'm a cultural and linguistic anthropologist, which means I study issues of language in relation to day-to-day use and in particular societies. My own research is in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and I have written most of my academic writings on race relations, questions of race and language, identity, ideology, things like that in Brazil. But I teach here at the University of Arizona classes in linguistic anthropology and also on race relations. And in particular, I teach a class called Race and Language in the US. And political correctness is one of the topics that we cover in that class. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because it brings together two of the main things that I study and teach about and research. One is the question of language, right? What does language do? How should we think about language? How can we watch language actually do things in society, bring people together, bring people apart, lead to policies that affect people's lives, lead to violence that obviously also affects people's lives. So the question of how we understand language theoretically as never neutral, as always seeped in a larger sociopolitical context related to questions of who people are, how they think about themselves, how they think and treat other people. That's one of the topics that I teach about from the perspective of understanding language and appreciating how much gets done through language. But the other topic that I research and think about is race. And I am super interested in understanding how it is that we have constructed race as something that is so meaningful in our lives, that impacts so much, organizes our society, impacts the ways that people interact with each other and their access to rights and resources. So I also teach classes that are on the topic of social and racial justice. So if you take political correctness and think about it as language that has to do often with how we talk about minority groups, you can see how that topic in particular brings together my interests. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this topic. I have a lot of different examples that I bring into my classes in terms of current day events. That's one of my favorite things to do, is to really think through things that are going on right now, from like memes that people are exposed to debates that are going on. So I'm happy to talk in any of those directions and to play around with different examples that you may have thought about or had questions and wondered more about.
Perfect. So you kind of spoke about how in your classes, you delve into what political correctness is. Can you maybe give our audience some background into where that came from and what it is exactly?
Sure. So our current use of political correctness is fairly recent. The term itself dates back and has a longer history, but what we think of as political correctness really comes out of the civil rights movement and starts to be more commonly referred to in the 1970s, as you have groups, minority groups that are fighting, really protesting, forming all kinds of activist groups, struggling for rights and recognition in society. And one of the avenues, one of the things that they start to protest is how they're referred to and their own ability to name themselves as a community, to refer to themselves and have other people refer to them with respect. And so the initial start of political correctness goes way back to things that sometimes people wouldn't even question as much now. The idea that you might want to, when you talk about a group of women, you would call them women if they're not kids and not girls, right? The idea that You should think about how you refer to Native Americans or Asian Americans, all of those terms, right? Latinos, the term Latinos, and then all kinds of other terms that come out from that. Now it's moved to Latinx communities, Chicanos, Chicanas, all African Americans, all of these terms are the start of political correctness and the idea that these groups were fighting for a certain kind of recognition. So there's a history to a lot of those different terms also. Things like why African Americans, right? The idea, why Asian Americans, right? The idea that these groups were fighting for recognition as legitimate Americans, right? That they wanted to be seen and treated and understood as Americans, right? So that gets put into the name. So it starts as that kind of movement out of these different groups in this very politicized context in US history. And initially it really is an idea of respect, right? You don't just call somebody by the name you come up with for them. You ask them what their name is, and when they tell you, you call them by that name, right? So that kind of idea as a language of respect and being respectful of how people want to be referred to is the initial idea behind political correctness. What happens, and there's a lot more we can talk about in terms of this, but what happens is that that enters into a US political scene where significant gains are made by these groups, and there's a backlash. And I'm talking 80s, 90s, but clearly what I'm talking about, we can talk about going on right now, right? And there's plenty of current ramifications to that, recent gains, backlash towards those gains from these groups. And so then it starts to be that political correctness gets spun, not as being respectful, but as something that has to do with thought police or language police. Then it gets spun even further to be something that's mocked. So I always use this example with my students to say things like, well, nowadays you can say, not to be PC or anything, right? That's super common to say. Or you'll say something and be like, not that I'm PC. But if you think about where political correctness came from, you can see how far it has moved, right? People have moved it to mean something different, because if it meant respectful, then nobody would say that. Not to be respectful or anything, right? Nobody could say it. That's not what you're saying, right? Nobody's trying to be disrespectful, but the idea of what political correctness was, what it represents, what it did, gets spun by people, and this is very much caught up in a left-right, conservative, liberal political struggle, and it gets spun as something that is to be mocked, or to be disdained, or something that you don't want to be associated with. Not to be PC or anything no longer means not to be respectful or anything, because most people aren't saying that they're intending to be disrespectful when they say that, right? So there's this long history of how this gets changed and how it actually is embroiled in US political struggle, right? All starting with the civil rights movement.
So I'm glad that you brought up how political correctness kind of has stemmed from these major movements. And in recent years, we've seen things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, which you can just see clearly that it's usually associated with leftist politics.
Mm-hmm.
And with the rise of right-wing groups, or even Donald Trump during the 2016 election, is this rejection of being politically correct kind of the right's own movement in a way of rejecting, I guess, political correctness in a way?
So you're asking if it's rejecting politics as well as rejecting language?
Yeah, as a way of just being politically correct, how because Me Too and Black Lives Matter are often these touchy, controversial topics, that the right of rejecting political correctness, rather than just treating it rather just touchy, they just don't want it to be touchy whatsoever, and that we should, I guess, see it as normal in a way, I guess, instead of treating it like touchy subjects, just normalizing these kinds of groups.
Okay, so there's a couple of things behind that. First of all, I think that one of the most important things to understand about political correctness is that there's a struggle there for what language is and what it does. And those who are arguing for political correctness are saying that language is politics. It does represent your point of view. It does communicate the way that you're thinking, who you're aligning with, who you're aligning against, right? Language is always political, right? And that is a view that anybody who studies language in any shape or form would agree with, right? So anybody from the linguistics department to sociolinguists to linguistic anthropologists over in the anthropology department is going to tell you that language is never neutral, right? Even a dictionary is not neutral. Somebody decides what to put in a dictionary and what not to put in a dictionary, right? Is a term an official term? Is it officially language? Can you use it in Scrabble, right? Somebody decides that, right? But that's a somebody, and that somebody doesn't exist in a bubble. They exist in a context, right? So people who argue for political correctness say language is and was always political, right? What we're trying to do is argue for a different political view and to represent a different political view and to point out to the people who are using language as if it's neutral, that it's not. And the backlash against that, when you start to talk about language police or policing language, are trying to hang on to that idea, which again has no basis in any kind of linguistic theory, that language is neutral, right? That if you're forcing somebody to use a different word, there was a neutral, safe option, and it's now the people forcing you to think about your language that are making it political. They're the ones that are turning it into a political game. And so there's a sense there that what it is, that people are working with very different ideas about language. Again, one of them would not be academically supported, that language could be neutral and that there is a safe way to talk that doesn't come from any perspective, doesn't insult people or have an effect in the world, it's just neutral, it's just the language itself. And then this then comes into that idea of the fact that, you know, when we can look at the struggle, we are looking at a struggle that's over politics, right? It's not just over language. And there's lots of different things that you can say about that. First of all, you can say, well, some people are choosing to fight that struggle linguistically because they don't feel like it's safe to do it other ways, right? Like if you say, I don't think black people should have the right to vote, then most people in society today would say that's kind of racist, right? That they would call that out as straight up racism, as coming from a place that you're assuming that black people are inferior to white people, right? That kind of view is no longer palatable. I hesitate because things are shifting all around us, right? Post-Charlottesville, it's hard to say that that's not publicly acceptable anymore because it's out there. But really, it's not tolerated by the majority of society. To say, well, I don't understand why some people can use the N-word and other people can't. That's not fair. Language should be neutral, and everybody should be able to say whatever they want to say, right? It's racist to suggest that some people can use that word and other people can't, right? Is coming from a very different perspective, and that seems safer, right, to say, I think, in some ways. And it also starts to reveal, though, the ways in which this is ultimately about a struggle over politics. And you can look at the backlash against language as one of the ways that this political struggle over the role of minorities, of women, people of different sexual orientation and sexual identities, right, that society's changing very rapidly. Right? And norms are changing very rapidly. And some people are looking for ways to resist that, right? They're not comfortable with those changes, they don't agree with those changes, and so they find ways to protest that, and one of those ways is through political correctness, an attack on political correctness.
Right. So I want to kind of shift in a way, because we understand that political correctness is a major issue within the United States, but I like how you brought up how one of your major research interests is within Brazil. And we saw last month Brazil had its presidential election in which Jair Bolsonaro won, and he's often been referred to as by several news outlets or John Oliver as the Trump of the South because of the statements he's made. So has this issue of political correctness, is it just unique to the United States? Or are we starting to see, I guess, this rejection of language all across the world?
So that's a good question. I think the term political correctness is specific to the United States. I haven't heard that same term used in Brazil, and I'm trying to think of other national context where I've heard of that kind of debate. I think you have that kind of debate going on, certainly in places like England. I've seen people writing about this, and I think you have the linguistic debates, right? And I think what you see is that in all of these contexts, right, where there are these gains and struggles for minority rights, there are linguistic ramifications and ways that's played out through language. One of the interesting things I can tell you about in Brazil, and again, they wouldn't use the term political correctness, Jair Bolsonaro has said some unbelievable things, actually, things that make the discourse that's happening in the United States look very tame and civil. He said some unbelievable things, but some of the gains in Brazil have gone far past political correctness in the United States to actually make it illegal to be racist and say something racist to somebody is now a crime in Brazil. And that was done fairly recently, but for many years nobody was actually prosecuted under that. And that is one of the things that has changed, again, with gains for minority rights that have happened in Brazil as well. So people started to be prosecuted, right, for saying something racist. So think about that, right? If somebody was obviously racist, hurled a racial epithet at somebody in the United States, there are different consequences, right? If you were on a university campus, there would be consequences. If it was accompanied by violence, it would be a crime in the United States. But the actual act of hurling a racial epithet is not a crime in the United States, and it is in Brazil.
Do you believe that it should be a crime in the United States?
Oh, that's a super complicated issue. We come back to that. But it is in Brazil, and so he actually was in a situation, and this happened a couple of years ago, before he sort of burst onto the political scene. He was not a major political figure, other than being known for being very far-right and conservative and supportive of the military dictatorship. But he had a situation a couple of years ago where he was speaking to an Afro-Brazilian female political, she was a politician. She was, I think, also an elected official. And something was being discussed around sexual assault. And he actually turned to her in front of other people. So she's an elected official. She's a black female, which there are not that many of in Brazilian politics. And in roles like that, and they're discussing sexual assault, and he turned to her and said, "You are too ugly. I would rape you, but you're too ugly." This in Portuguese, right, was his exact words. It was documented. There was an audience for it, right? You're too ugly to rape, right? And he was prosecuted. He actually was successfully prosecuted because that is against Brazilian law. So it's a super complicated question, right, of how far do we want to go in dealing with, and how do you want to deal with language in the United States? Should things like hurling a racial epithet be a crime? But the interesting thing to me for that is to answer your question, that without the term political correctness, you can see how questions of language and these questions of respect and how to treat people, particularly groups that are historically disenfranchised, discriminated against, and stigmatized still today. How do we deal with that? And in that case, you can see how he obviously didn't physically assault her in any way. And his words were considered enough of an assault, right, that he was prosecuted for that. I don't think there was jail time associated or anything like that, but he was prosecuted and convicted of having broken that law against being racist and racist discourse. So these are questions, but the role of language in this can't ever be taken out of the question, right, in any of these contexts, regardless of whether we call it or someone refers to it as political correctness or not.
Okay, and so you spoke a lot about hate speech, just barely. So don't you think there's a difference between hate speech and just ignorance? I hesitate to say that, especially because some people who don't believe in the idea of political correctness don't prescribe to the idea that it's ignorance, simply that it's expression. So do you believe there's a line between hate speech and political correctness in those terms?
I think there's a whole continuum here, and I think this is why when you said, so should it be against the law, right? You can be verbally abusive to somebody without saying, and none of the words that you actually use could be offensive. You don't have to use a racial epithet to be verbally abusive and insult and harm, right? Harm a person, particularly, right, somebody who comes from a different racial background that is stigmatized and historically oppressed, right? So there's a whole range here of language itself, but then how language gets used, right? And so this is something that comes up in classes a lot too, where students start to get nervous, like, so can I never say this, or is it ever okay for, they like this one, is it ever okay for a white person to say the N-word? And more interesting to me is the question of why are white people so interested in using that word, right? And why does it get framed as a right that's being taken away from white people? Why don't we investigate more the history of that term, and then knowing the history of that term, why white people would want to have anything to do with it, right? So I think there's an entire scale there, and I think there's lots of ways to start to think about what kind of language do you use, how do you use it, and what do you want to convey? And then the question becomes, when do other people get to tell you that? Right? So I teach at the University of Arizona. The University of Arizona has its own policies, like many universities across the country, diversity and inclusion, and creating an atmosphere that is safe and tolerant and inclusive of all experiences, and meant to protect all people's rights to study and learn. What does that mean? It means that I can actually center what people say in my classroom. Right? And the question becomes, how and when do you do that, right? Have there been situations where somebody has used a term mostly out of ignorance, right? And you can tell from the way someone's saying it, right? That they're not hurling a racial epithet, that they're saying something that they don't realize is offensive. I remember once, several years ago, I've been teaching here, this is my 15th year here, so this was quite a while ago, but there was an African American student in my class who came from somewhere in the South, and she was talking about Asian Americans, and she used the word Orientals. And from the way she was speaking, it was very clear that she wasn't intending to offend anybody, but that word to the Asian Pacific American community is also referred to like as if the N-word, they call it the O-word, right? There are places in Washington State where there's a significant Asian American population. That word is banned in any kind of official documents, right? Because people have been so offended by that word, and there's a strong enough population that they were actually able to put a law in the books that any kind of documents that are coming from the state will not refer to people in that way. And so at that time, it wasn't about trying to kick her out of class or, insult her or shame her. It was more a point of reference, and it's something that I do discuss every semester. Okay, so what is the history of that word? Why is it heard as so offensive to some people, right? Well, and that you can do pretty quickly, because even if people come from a community, which she did, where that word is just commonly used, there is a growing Asian American population in the American Southeast, but not a significant, certainly nothing like the Pacific Northwest, right? So you can have people who don't live in communities where there's a strong Asian American presence, right? And so, in that case too, it was also about thinking about the history of that word. Well, when else do we use that word? To refer to rugs and lamps and other carpets and, right, other kinds of inanimate objects. Right? So why might that be offensive, right? If we're using a word that's typically used for inanimate objects also to refer to people, might that be offensive, right? And people can quickly see, then you can also think more about the term. Where does it come from? Orient means the east. Well, east of who, right? So what is the bias in there, and who gets to determine that you're east, right? It means that you're centering a particular experience, a Western experience, where the East, the Far East, right, starts to sound like some kind of exotic locale. do you, and then we base that in a no longer discussion about stereotypes of Asian Americans, right? How the history of how Asian Americans have been treated as not ever properly American in this country, right? So that is a situation for me where you can see, where I clearly see it as one where, okay, making sure that people are aware of the history of terms and then saying, now think about the language that you want to use, right?
So sometimes people use these terms, not in ill intent, but sometimes out of ignorance. So in those cases, do you think political correctness can go too far and kind of ruin a conversation that could be happening? Because we're, instead of paying attention to what they're saying, the content of their speech, we're paying attention to how they're saying it, which I would concede that it's important to correct people in that way. But do you think political correctness can go too far in the fact that we're often focusing too much on how people are saying it instead of the intention of the message?
So I was kind of curious to see what the other panelists were going to say on this topic, because the question of can you go too far in political correctness is clearly one that, depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, you probably have a very different view. So I'd be interested to hear things from the audience too and other points of view. Can you go too far in political correctness? I have a hard time thinking of when and how, right? If you take political correctness as I do, as an understanding that A, language is never neutral and always political, and B, it's about being respectful of people that you're talking to, people that you're talking about. If I pose the question to you, so can you ever be too respectful of somebody, and does that ever hinder? It's hard to imagine a situation where being too respectful hinders a conversation. I think there's questions of how do you deal with it, right? How do you deal with raising people's awareness and understanding of the term? I think that's a valid question. I think it's certainly important to not be ever listening just to what the words people are using, but to separate that is to suggest that there's some, again, neutral language that they're using, and then there's their belief system, and that those are separated. And those can't ever really be separated, right? Can people be using terms in a way that evoke things for other people that they're unaware of? Absolutely, right? And so, if you've ever had an argument with anybody significant to you in your life, and you say, that's not what I meant, and they say, but that's what I heard, and you say, I wasn't insulting you, and they say, but I was insulted, right? People can disagree, right, about what a term means and what you hear when it's said and what you meant to say. That's, I think, a place for productive discussion, right? But the idea of political correctness going too far, I will leave that open to the audience to start posing some examples of it. Maybe we can see if you can get me to say this.
I think we're actually ready to turn to the audience, so if anyone has any questions, you can just start with Sam.
Yeah, so you said you couldn't really think of an example of taking political correctness too far, but I was kind of curious after you said in Brazil that it was like illegal to say something that was racist, like how do you draw that line? Like, because in the context of the student who was using the word Oriental and didn't recognize that was offensive, like under the letter of the law, that could potentially still be banned. So like, would there be a list of everything you can't say, or?
Okay, so first of all, I think there's a big difference between saying that political correctness is about stuff you can't say. Political correctness is about encouraging you to think about the history of words that you're using and the politics, right? The messages that it conveys, right? Being forced to think about that and acknowledge that all words have a history and a context is very different than saying, here's a list of banned words. Now, you can push me on that because there's a lot of places to go. Could you give me a list of words that I ban in my class? Absolutely. And so we can go there. And the I word, you can see how people keep playing up the N word, illegal, used with people, right? To talk about what I would refer to as undocumented immigrants, right? Is a good example. Would I ban that word in my class? I certainly have long discussions about why using that word would show that you don't understand the concepts we're talking about in the class. So that's a good example to come back to. So it's not so much the idea of like thinking about political correctness as things you can't say, I think is already buying into that spin of it's no longer about respect, it's about people trying to like stomp out other people's rights to say and think in a particular way. So I'm more interested in asking people to recognize what they're aligning themselves with when they talk and say, is that really what you mean? Let me give you an example. And I also would love audience input on this because this is a current situation that I'm really, this has changed in my classes over the years. And many of you will be familiar with this and I have no idea where this comes from, so I'm really trying to figure it out. After the Civil Rights Movement, one of the politically correct ways to refer to different minority groups was people of color. Why that term? You're foregrounding the fact that they're people, right? We've just given examples of the ways that so many terms, from illegal to the O word, take away people's humanity, dehumanize them, right? Make them seem like less human and less like people, and then allow for all kinds of politics and violence, because if they're not as human, then those things are okay. So people of color became the term of respect. And I use that term a lot when you're talking about different groups, and I have used it in my classes for years. And what I have noticed over the last few years is that students in my class, again, either unintentionally or unknowingly, have started to refer to colored people. I'm saying people of color, and they're saying colored people. Now, I stop, and we have to have a long discussion about what is colored people, and why is people of color and colored people, why are those two completely different things? They come from very different historical moments, right? I have students think about the fact that where would you have ever seen colored, right, to refer to people, and then that, you know, water fountain image that most of us have not lived through, but we can call to mind, right, of white, and then, you know, water dripping down, and a fountain for colored people, right? That's where that term came from, Jim Crow segregation, right? And the idea that people of color were actually legally treated as inferior to white people, right? It's a completely a term that is bred out of white superiority, white supremacism, and so students are using it in my class, not from that history, not meaning to align themselves with that history. And I'm really curious where that's coming from, because I've noticed it as new and why that is. But, so back to your question of, you know, banning words, or when does it go too far? What would I do if a student, after I had that conversation about what does the term people of color mean, where does it come from, what politics are behind that versus colored people, if I had a student continue to use the term colored person, either they're not getting the material, at which point their grade would suffer just as it would in any class that you showed that you were not done, you know, when they go over the concept of gravity, if you keep misusing the term, right, you would be downgraded in the class. It would have consequences in my class, right, because you're either showing that you don't understand what we're talking about, or you are intentionally using it, right, against the teachings of the class and the purpose of the class. So, you know, again, I find those situations, and I'm trying to remember whether I have actually answered your original question there. So maybe you can tell me.
No, I think you did.
The idea there that, you know, you can go too far. I'm not interested in prosecuting people, and I'm not interested in prosecuting my students, right? But I certainly am teaching them how to think about their language in relation to questions of social and racial justice, which are the purpose of my class, and I lay that out very clearly in the beginning. So, are there ways in which there would be consequences for making those choices? Sure, but and if students continue to use terms that we've discussed, right, then I would take it as a sign of their intentionality, right, and their desire to really show that they are not. I mean, think about the power that has, and that's why political correctness is such a hot button issue for people. It's about power, right? I mean, if somebody says to you, "My name is Roberto," and you say, "Oh, hi, Robert," right? Yeah, and then you continue. I mean, think about me as a professor, right? If a student said, "My name is Roberto, and here's what I want to say," and then for the entirety of the class, I kept saying, "Well, Robert here," or Bobby. I mean, think about how much power that has, right? To refuse to recognize people for the way that they're asked asking to be recognized. And recognize too that when we're talking about these topics, it's not just a name, right? That the way that it ties into questions of dehumanization, right? When you continue to refer to a group of people as aliens or as illegals, right? You strip them of their humanity, their suffering, and their rights to be here, right? And that is a complete political orientation, right? That you start to have towards who they are and what they deserve and what can happen to them. So there are real consequences to language, right? And that is something that I think is super, and yet buried under lots of memes and lots of jokes, right? Behind the term political correctness and how it's been used.
I think we have another question in the back.
Going to say something, because our experience when you were talking about, I don't know if you said like white people asking if it was okay to use the N-word. I've actually had people ask me if it was okay to use the N-word. I've actually had somebody actually call me the N-word. And I think a lot of it is they listen to rap and they think that they hear their favorite rapper saying it, so they're just repeating what they're hearing on the song. And they'll find it offensive to other people. And also like, I've heard people say like, oh, that term doesn't mean what it used to mean back in the 1800s. It's different now. Now it means we're friends.
Right. Well, we all know that there's two different variants of that word, right? And there's ways of using it that make it sound like a friend and ways of using it that very much do not make it sound like a friend, right? Yeah, so this is one of those topics that comes up, right? Of struggles over words and who can use them, and what if your intention is good and your friend said you could, is it okay? And I think part of the purpose, and certainly that I'm trying to get across in my classes and in questions like this, is to really understand the history behind it and understand what it means to other people, right? So what is the history of that term? How can it still be used, right? And how is it still continuously used to strip people of their humanity, and then decide, do you really need to be a part of that? Do you want to be a part of that, right? Is that one word? So this is one of the places where it gets so fascinating, right? Where on the one hand, one of the arguments against political correctness is like, why are you paying so much attention to language? So I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and this is an easy critique, right? Like, why so much? People are dying, people are paid less for their work, people are being mass incarcerated, and really you're focusing on language, right? And what that represents, it's not that I don't care about all those other things, right, is that these things are very much connected, right? How you talk about people, how you talk to them, how you talk about them, has everything to do with the political environment we live in, and what kinds of policies you endorse, and what kind of things become normalized and naturalized for you, of how people can be treated. So I see these things as completely related, and I know that they are related because this is the passion that people have about these fights over language, right? Get really vicious. I mean, have you ever seen a Tommy Lauren video on this? I mean, right? People care. So it's clearly not just about language, and language is not so neutral when people are like doing all these rants, right? And in fear, and really becoming furious at the idea that they're being told what they can, and that's how they perceive it, what they can or cannot say, right? So I think trying to really think through like what's behind that, and who has had the power to name other people, right? And now that backlash to being told, maybe you don't get to name me, maybe you shouldn't get to name me, maybe there are things about my experience and my history that you need to think more about how you talk about, or ask me how you should talk about them and how that sounds to me, right? It's a really, it reveals the political moment that we're in and the different sides of that issue.
I think we have a question over here.
So you kind of talked about political correctness with the general public and like politicians, but what role do you think the media plays in that? And because of the reach they have, do you think they have a greater responsibility to be political correct?
So thank you, because that allows me to come back to the I word. And there's some great videos on the Drop the I Word campaign, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. There is a whole campaign to get specifically the media and major news outlets to stop referring to people with using the term illegal, right? And offering all kinds of alternatives, right? But to say people can't be illegal, right? People are people, right? They can do things that are breaking laws, but that is not who they are, right? People are people. And you dehumanize them by calling them aliens, you dehumanize them by referring to them as illegal. And so that was a major campaign specifically targeted to the media, with the idea that it has a major effect on how people think, and then, you know, again, the ways that you start to think about people, the kind of violence that led to, right? There are lots of documented attacks that are on the rise, hate crimes and documented attacks against Mexican Americans, undocumented immigrants, right? So, you know, connecting that and saying, yes, news outlets, you have a major journalists, you have a major responsibility here in the message that you're sending people about who they are and how you are portraying them. Then, you know, how do you portray their struggles, but in particular, how do you even, let's start with how you refer to them. And they were successful. Not all, to my knowledge, not all news outlets have signed on to it, but the APA, I mean, it took years of trying to spread the word to say, this is the media, you do have a major responsibility here. And it took a lot of political pressure and public activism to make a change there, but there has been a change. Now, that said, you know, we're on a campus that, if I'm not wrong, you can still use your CAT card at Illegal Pete's, Mexican, am I not wrong? Has anyone been there recently? You don't have to. Does anyone know that, someone? Not you. Someone who's been, right? Illegal Pete's, Mexican, right? Still playing on the side connection of illegality with Mexican, right? And the university has an official connection, is supporting that by letting students, right? So they clearly have had an impact, but there's a lot out there still, right? And that's a major debate too between, right, who should be able to, there was lots of student activism when that restaurant opened. Mecha was particularly involved in trying to get him to change the name and not make that connection and not force. I've had students who were previously undocumented who have very powerful and dramatic immigration stories that they've lived through, and then have to walk past that restaurant as, you know, every day, you know, as part of campus, because the university is part of our campus, right? And the trauma that evokes for them, of being called that and having their experience, right, turned into, you know, a brand, right? So yes, the media has a certain role to play, and then I think the university, right, should have a role to play, and commercial businesses, right? I mean, I think there's lots of places where you can try and make an impact on how people think about these topics.
Yeah. Do you watch it change throughout, like, history? Have you, like, seen it change when, like, the media stops using a certain word? Does, like, the population around kind of, like, change their ways too?
I mean, certainly you can see an impact to that, right? For journalists, definitely, right? Just because they're so, you know, their words get spread so widely. I think the question, you know, of what kind of impact, like these different small areas, I mean, I think it's important to be raising awareness wherever and however you can. I think that has an impact, and it's just worth doing, even if it's, you know, initially a small impact, right? The problem with dehumanization and using terms that start to dehumanize people and make you think of them as different. I mean, one of the things we're talking about here with language is how we refer to people, and then how do you create these differences between people. Race is all about creating differences between people that don't exist in a biological or scientific way, but we continue to make natural and normal until you really can't see the world without seeing people as fundamentally different from you. Well, the minute you start to emphasize those differences, right, you allow for different kinds of treatment of people, right? They're not the same as you. They don't need to be protected in the same way. And so I think all of these things are really important to recognize the ways in which language helps create those differences that then allow for all kinds of terrible situations and things that people wouldn't ordinarily agree with, right? People don't ordinarily agree with violence against other people, right? That has to happen, that people become desensitized, right?
What about language that's like inherently gendered or unique towards something? So there was a movement with women and wanting to replace like the men aspect with the Y, so it wasn't the woe and man. Do you think that that's like a good shift in the direction of trying to go to the language itself and shift it, or?
I think there are lots of places where people have done things like that it's caught on. The one example you're giving is a place where it didn't really catch on. But an example where it has caught on is the new term Latinx, right? That now is Chicanx, right? So you're replacing an O, which is the masculine generic, because right, women, you're at one man and 100 women, and you got to go to the O, right? And so it's clearly gendered and clearly sexist and patriarchal in its orientation, and so that is a place where they have been successful in making that change linguistically, right? And in getting people to recognize what that means and the ways in which that constantly emphasizes men as the norm, male as the normal, right? So I think that those kinds of struggles, I can't predict for you which one, or explain even why some campaigns have been successful and others haven't. I'm more interested in watching the political battles around them and then really trying to understand like what's at stake and why people get, I think it's always interesting to stop and ask why, when people are asking for a change, who's asking for it and why, and then when people are resisting that change, what are they protecting, right? And then make your decision about where you fall in that.
Yeah.
I just kind of think the phrase "Yas Queen" has been very gamified on the internet, but that phrase comes from people of color,
Okay, wait, I need this one. I get all my best material from you guys, so go. I need more background, and I'm probably not the only one. Go ahead.
When you see like YASSSKWEEN,
Okay.
As like a stamp of approval on the internet, and that's something that I've been told comes from a section of Twitter that's self-identifies as Black Twitter. But then in like regular conversations, people of color would be expected to sort of code switch and probably not use that phrase that came from their own culture. And that's a relatively recent, and I guess compared to a lot of the words, innocuous example, but I mean
So you're talking about examples of linguistic appropriation or cultural appropriation, or maybe the term that people have heard. That's now like spreading more and more, right? How many of you here have heard of cultural appropriation, right? So now that's out there, and linguistic appropriation is using language to do that. So is your question? Well, so the politics behind that are super complicated, right? And super interesting, right? The ways in which certain groups, particularly minority groups, who are often being very innovative in the areas of language, why? And culture, why? Because it's, right, one of the few places that you don't have to have significant resources or access to power, right? And so you get lots of creative resistance, right, and creativity coming out of minority communities, right, particularly in language. And then you have white people, white groups, even corporations, right, being like, oh, that'll sell something for me, right? So I've actually worked with some undergrads we're still working on a paper analyzing how corporate brands on Twitter now have their Twitter, like a social media branding kind of thing, where they're trying to use like young, black, hip hop, savvy, they're supposed to be their voice. So you have, I know you guys know this, any of you who are on Twitter. So this is the opposite of Black Twitter, by the way. So this is where things like IHOP tweets out things like pancakes on fleek, right? And so they're appropriating, right, what they see as cool, young, hip kinds of language, right, to sell their brand, right? And then there's all kinds of interesting debates as Black Twitter fires back around that. But I bring up that example because it speaks to, I think, where you were going with that, which is where you still live in a society where white corporations are more than happy to profit off of African American linguistic innovations. And yet, I have an example too of somebody who tweeted out a poster that was in one of these fast food break rooms or restrooms where the employees were, of terms not to use when you're working here. And the same terms, right, that they're selling are the terms that you won't get hired if you use in an interview, right? And so, I mean, that speaks to this A, how important language is, B, how much it is seeped in this political context, and context where power relations are, right, swirling all around us, and see how integral they are to that, right? So you can see things like that with both the appropriation and yet the continued stigmatization, right? And not just stigmatization, right? It has an actual cost, and it perpetuates inequality if people can't get jobs because of the way they speak, but IHOP and Denny's can make money, right? And promote their brand by pretending that that's how they speak. Because everybody knows that the guy, you know, the 50-year-old white guys behind those social media accounts, right? They speak standard English, and they're the ones like tweeting these things out, right? So, you know, that's a great example, right, of how enmeshed in politics and struggles and struggles over social and racial justice language is, right?
I think we have a question right here.
Yeah, sorry for that. Just excuse my language, I'm just learning English, but I understand what you say. It would start with Ludwig Wittgenstein, his linguistic or mathematics in England. He said that the language creates our thoughts, and we can't think outside the language. From what I'm seeing, from what I'm read, from the trade or any linguistics, French, German, all they agree that the language, it's not outside. No, it's create our thoughts. We can't even think out without language. So that answer for people, they said it's not important to
Worry about language.
worry about language. On the other hand, there's a story. It happened in the 18th century. There is a famous novelist who won a Nobel Prize. Some religious guy just stand up and he said he's non-Muslim. That's it. But this word has consequences, and it lead to some crazy guy. He stabbed him in his neck. The question is, the second thing, in your class, you said, according to my understanding, you said that if you didn't understand what I'm saying, you will downgrade. But I mean, how we could protect freedom of speech beside the political or language correction. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so that's a good question, and there's lots to say there about linguists have lots of theories about how much does language influence, in the language you speak, influence how you think. And even if they debate that, whether it really, like somebody who learns in one language has a completely different version of the world than someone who learns a different language, even if they debate that, nobody would debate that language is integral to how you think, right, and your view of the world. So let's dive back into this idea of, so am I clamping down on freedom of speech in my class? Of course. So every single class and every single professor you're taking a class from is clamping down on freedom of speech. If you're in a physics class and you have an exam and you write lots of really smart and interesting things about biology, you're going to fail that exam. You could say, but freedom of speech, absolutely, you are free to write whatever you want. That doesn't mean that you're demonstrating knowledge of the class appropriately and writing things that are the correct answers to the test, right? So the freedom of speech thing, there's plenty to be said when we come back to that question of, so should it be illegal, right? Like, should it be against the law to hurl a racial epithet, for example? And I don't know. I mean, I think there's so many interesting things to say about that. I don't know that I have a quick answer about whether I would say, yes, it should be, or no, it shouldn't be. Certainly, I want us to recognize that language has power, that verbal, I mean, we're in a context right now where we're playing out also the fact that sexual harassment doesn't have to have a physical component, right? To be something that we need to take seriously, to recognize that it has an effect, that it creates the patriarchal society we live in and the unequal gender representation. And so, I want to say that language has power and recognize and acknowledge that. I don't know that I want to criminalize all acts of it. I think that is an open question for me. In a classroom, however, I completely support the University of Arizona's policy that this needs to be an open and tolerant space where all people are given the opportunities to learn and to feel respected and to feel trusted, and that they are going to be treated fairly. And I do think that students, we've had all kinds of things that have happened. Again, I pointed to the illegal Pete's example on our campus, which we haven't done anything about. And then you have situations where there's campuses where nooses get placed, right, on, in trees as African American students have to walk by the class. Should the university, in my mind, be investigating that? And again, universities aren't prosecuting students in the same way, but should they be investigating those as violations of an academic code of conduct? Absolutely, right? Now, is it free speech to be able to hang a noose? Yeah. Should that be protected on a college campus where you are impinging on other people's freedom to be able to study there without harassment and without concern for their safety, right? What do you value there? And where should you come down? I think that campuses have been very clear, and there continue to be challenges to this, but I think most campuses are pretty adamant and will fight hard for the idea that they need to respect diversity and inclusion, and that they're not doing, and I think many of them would admit that they're not doing enough to make sure that happens. And does that mean that you're impeding people's freedom? Sure, but that's true of many environments and communities, right? If you get hired into a corporation, you can't say whatever you want and expect to keep your job. And then when they fire you because you're speaking inappropriately, just say, well, freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not the same as an ability to participate as a member of this community, to have a job, right? I think there are limits that we recognize happen in all kinds of different ways.
So I have two questions. One, are you okay still going on for more questions?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm interested in that. In some ways, sometimes it feels as though the people who are most likely to be politically incorrect are also people who are probably least likely to be persuaded by the idea that they need to be more careful of their language, right? Mm-hmm. And also people who are most likely to already be careful about their language are also people who are already being politically correct. So how do you persuade sort of like the gettable people in the middle that this is something that they should really be cognizant of?
Okay, so you're asking me about the gettable people, not the people who are not interested in... I don't have to debate Tommy Lahren, is what you're saying, right? I don't have to convince Tommy Lahren, right? Because I'm not going to get anywhere with her, right? She is convinced of her position, right? And she's using language exactly the way that she wants to reflect. She's very aware of the political position that she has and how she's using language in accordance with it. So my argument, right, of make sure your language matches your politics would go nowhere with her, right? So I think that's one argument in the middle. I think another argument in the middle is to start to, again, bring it back to that question of respect and the idea of understanding the history, right? I do think there's a lot of ignorance out there. I do think there's a lot of people who say things that they haven't been forced to think about. And I think when you have the right kind of spaces to let people think about it and talk about it and debate it, right? Like really say, well, what about? I mean, my classes are always run not as a lecture, but as a discussion, because if just lecturing at people is far less effective than having people say, well, what about this, right? So I think that allowing people to have that kind of discussion and making sure that you're bringing in the political side of it, the historical side of it, and then asking them to think about what their values are, right? And where their values lie. I think it's harder work to convince people that language has an effect, right? The ways that language feeds into dehumanization is something that I spend a lot more time on in my class, because the idea is that's not automatically apparent to people, right? But again, we're getting a lot further with the ideas of sexual harassment as a form of actual assault, right? It's a different kind of assault, but it clearly impacts people, right? And clearly creates situations where some people are privileged and other people are made to feel like they don't belong, like they can't participate. So I think that there's lots of arguments that you can make and discussions that you can have if people are willing to listen, and if they're willing to really hear what you have to say and to really think about it. And it's not important to me, I don't have a list of banned words, I don't have a list. I mean, I would never use the N-word, but it's not important to me that every white student, to pass my class, you don't have to sign a pledge saying I'm never going, right? That's not, right? That's not part of the class so much as understanding and really forcing those questions of, so here's the history of this word, here's how it's still used, right? To justify and legitimize incredible acts of violence. Here's probably the most powerful word in the English language over history, and a word that has been used to dehumanize and inflict unbelievable power and suffering, right, onto a group of people, right? Do you need to be a part of that, right? I think those are the kinds of questions that people who are willing to really think and posing them as questions, like where do you stand, right? I see a lot of movement there, and I see a lot of opportunities to raise people's awareness about all kinds of things that, it doesn't need to be, there's no rules of like, you can never say this, or you should never say that. One of the things, but just thinking about the fact that language has consequences, that what it can be used to use, even if you don't use it that way, right? Sometimes when students ask about like, well, what about this term, and is this term? I say, okay, so here's the locker test, right? Like when you were in high school, right? If you walk into a high school, right? Think about political correctness as like, what words could you scrawl, like in spray paint across somebody's locker, right? We could think of tons of racial epithets and tons of words that you could say to like intimidate somebody, to threaten them, to make them feel like they don't belong, right? To make them feel as if they're inferior. And then the politically correct words are the words that you would never find there, right? If somebody really wanted to offend somebody, you don't write Chicanx, right? Nobody spray paints that on somebody's locker, right? Because it built into that word, right, is already more respect, more empowerment. Nobody's going to write African American and as the best insult they can come up with, right, for black people in this country, right? You know that those words are more respectful. You can hear it. You can think about how they get used, right? And so I think also just sort of having people understand the power of language, why it's important for them to think about language, is far more important to me than convincing them than giving them any kind of like flyer. I'm not like the the seafood people who have a list of don't eat, think about before you eat. I don't have those lists for my class, right? I'm more interested in the debate and the whole understanding the whole process of what role language plays in society.
Sean, and then.
Yeah, so I have two questions, both related to education. So the first is like, how do you think educators should approach, teaching about historical figures who, made really great accomplishments for our country, that have, things that they might have said at some point in their lives that were racist. For example, like Winston Churchill or Susan B. Anthony, we obviously owe a lot to them, but at the same time, they were known to make, racist comments that didn't really relate to what they accomplished, but they said those things. So how do we approach teaching that? My second question is should a book say Huckleberry Finn, should that be taught in public schools? Should it be compulsory reading, particularly with regard to students of color who might feel uncomfortable reading books that have certain language in them, because it is an important kind of window into a certain historical time. So how do we approach that as well?
I think all of that is important, and my approach is them all as opportunities to have this discussion, right? And to make people more aware and make students more aware of the power of language, the role of language, the historical changes to language, the way language is embedded in power relations. So I'd much prefer to see people teach these topics and then find ways to bring up, right, the really problematic elements to it, right, and the elements that they don't agree with. So if you're asking me on a practical level, right, would I read out loud a quote to my students that had racial slurs in it? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't utter them because I also understand that saying it, right, is in a way authorizing it, even though, you know, and kids know this too, right, when they repeat a curse word to you, and I didn't say it, I'm just saying what he said, right, but they've said it, right, and they've gotten, right, so I would be careful about things like that, but presenting it to students and then talking about it, right, where does this come from, what does it mean, what did it do, why don't we talk like that anymore, right, why wouldn't I even say, you know, why wouldn't I say the word, right, I think is a more powerful lesson than somehow, you know, sanitizing it, censoring it, things like that.
Yeah, my question is regarding your thoughts on whether there are some situations when we should be more accepting of politically incorrect or offensive language or topics. Where my mind is going with this is, say, with comedy, right? Which on one hand can have an entertainment function, but on the other hand can sometimes have a critical function. So let's say we're going to a comedy show to see like a Bill Burr or a Dave Chappelle or something like that. And on one hand, there's going to be some parody there, maybe some caricature that has value for social critique. But on the other hand, we know going in that this is going to be a racially charged show. There's going to be language and maybe taboo topics that we wouldn't expect in other contexts. In the interest of not restraining that discourse, that open discourse, in this case critical discourse, potentially through comedy, should we be accepting of some of these words and topics there? What are your thoughts?
So that's a really good question, and you'll notice I didn't say anything about black people using the N-word. I've been talking about white people using the N-word, and I think it's a very different context, right? I think that there are lots of good guidelines that people already know, right, about how to do things in socially appropriate ways, right? I can insult my mother if I'm really mad at her. You can't, right? You can't insult my mother to my face without there being consequences for that, right? So for a person to use in-group language, right, especially in comedy, as a way of also raising critique and protest, right, it's certainly not something that I'm going to, like, again, I'm not interested in just banning censor. That's not the understanding the politics behind it is the important part, and in that case, there's lots of places where that kind of critique, I think, is valid and important. So it's, you know, who's using it to whom, for what purpose, is all critical, and we know that because none of us could be functioning members of society, right? I mean, we'd be getting beaten up all the time if we didn't know how to use language appropriately and what we could say to who and when, right? So I think that but that's what gets lost, right? That's what gets lost in a discussion of language should be neutral, there should be parity, and everything should be equal, but equal means white people can use racial epithets if people of color can use them, right? As opposed to recognizing there's lots of nuances about how we use language and what it does and who should be able to, you know, why would you want to stay away from things? Not a ban so much as why would you want to avoid certain things? We avoid things in language all the time. That's not necessarily a freedom of speech issue, right? That's a how do you act as a social, as a, you know, somebody who interacts well with other people, who is respectful, right? So I think that the understanding that is a critical element, but that's, you know, the understanding of that is often lost, right? And then we jump quickly to, so you're saying, you're telling people they can't say this, or right, or you're banning, right? That's a very dramatic reading of it.
All right, that is going to be the end of our Q&A question, and with so many things, so many different topics being discussed tonight, I guess the overarching question above all is, whose responsibility is it, whether it's a government, education institutes, or even just like ourselves as basic human beings, whose responsibility is it in order to make sure that we don't have any more of this dehumanizing language or like negative language out in our world, and we can start having, I guess, more positive language or just language that is neutral?
Not neutral, because you're never going to get there, but more respectful, I think is what you meant, right? I think that there's lots of, you have to break that question down, right? So the idea, I would say I don't think we should necessarily be making it against the law to use a racial epithet. I certainly don't support it, right? But I don't know if I would make that illegal. Should governments be able to use words that are considered disrespectful to groups in language, right, in official documents? No, right? There's places there where you can start to see, like, okay, so does government have a responsibility, in the same way that the university does, to make it clear that they are responding to all of their citizens, they're giving equal rights to all of their citizens, they're being respectful, right, and that they represent, right, all of those citizens, right? Those are places where you can see where those kinds of policies would make sense. I mean, we used to have, across the country, we used to have tons of landmarks that had the N-word in them, right? And that was just what they were named, right? So it would be that creek or all kinds of racial epithets, but especially the N-word, that were actually official place names. And eventually those get banned and people have to change them, right? Because that the government decides that that is offensive and that that doesn't represent the stance that they are taking towards racial hierarchy, right? That they're not supportive of that racial hierarchy that reinforces. And yet you can look and see that while that was done for the N-word, it wasn't done across the board for racial slurs against Native Americans, for example. And that was a controversy in Arizona, right? We had things squaw, which is a racial slur against Native American women. There's a long history of that term. We still have that. And when they go to take that down, there's often a backlash, right? An outpouring of, this is political correctness gone too far, and it's always been referred to that way, and it's really people protecting the fact that they're not offended by that term, right? That term actually gives them a certain amount of power, and so they're protesting other people saying that's offensive to me, right? And who gets to decide, right? Should you be able to offend people, right? And yet that's not how they would read it, right? They read it as, that's an example where people would definitely say, political correctness gone too far. It's always been called that, right? It's, think about Native American mascots, right? Those kinds of issues, right? People's deep connection, and by this I mean white people generally, their deep connection to their ability, to these labels, to these images that were dehumanizing, that were steeped in racial hierarchy, and were permitted, and are now beginning to be ever more examined and called out, right? Think about the Confederate statues, the Confederate flag, right? And people, what those debates are about are very much in line with what the language political correctness debates are about too.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Thank you everyone for coming out. I'm just thinking, thank you Ashley, thank you Dr. Gordon. I'm just going to turn it over to Ted McLoof.
Can we get one like the loudest round of applause ever for absolutely just carried the night and did a fantastic job of being really informative, and I think this was awesome. And then a round of applause for our audience members. These were the best questions that we did. So again, we'll just wrap up, and this is the end of our fall season. season. This is our last event. The only other thing that's left is, again, our interns who are going to their final tournament next weekend in San Diego, so good luck to them. Please follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. You can tweet at us ideas for speaker series events. If you're interested in hearing a talk on something, absolutely, we're always open to hearing that. And the best way to find out about the events that we'll be having in the future is by following us on any of those social media platforms. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your semester. Thank you.